Snow fell through the black branches like sifted ash, and the gods would held its breath the way a sick room does when a healer lays his hand to a brow. John stood before the heart tree and let the red leaves comb his hair with the wind. The carved face looked down, carved by a hand he would never know, and the bleeding eyes made the snow on the ground seem brighter for their color. Ghost was a pale shadow at his side, silent but for the slow pull of his breath. He had been proclaimed, lifted up on a tide he never sought, and he had nodded because the shout in the hall had nowhere to go. King in the north, they said. King in words and in oaths and in the weight that settled on his shoulders like plate. The wood smelled of iron and cold. He could not hear the hall from here, only the thin chittering of ravens and the steady drip of melt from a bent branch. Sansa found him there, as she found him often. The fur collar of her cloak held a rim of ice, and behind her Brienne kept to the edge of the trees, broad and stiltingly careful not to intrude. Sansa came alone to the heart tree, though, and that was the thing that mattered. She stood beside him and did not speak for a long while. They watched the snow fall as if it were telling them a story slowly, letter by letter. "Is it what you want?" she asked at last, her voice low and even. "What I want," John said, "never seems to count for much, but it might be what we need." She turned her face up to him. There was a flake lodged on her eyelashes, a tiny spark of white that did not melt when she blinked. "Then speak when you do," she said. "If they have made you a king, don't be quiet about what matters." He looked at the heart tree. The red mouth seemed to curl with old knowledge. "We are not ready for the war they want," he said. "We are not ready for any war that isn't the one already coming." He could almost see the wall as he spoke, the blue slope of it in memory, the gulls wheeling over Eastwatch, Sam's fingers numbed to the bone by wind. "We do not have men to waste south of the neck." "They will hate that," Sansa said, without judgment. "They will say stark loyalty demands vengeance. They will call it cowardice, or worse, treason." "I am not a Stark," he said softly, and the ache of it was dull, a bone that had been broken so long ago it only remembered pain when the weather turned. "But I was raised one, and I won't leave northern boys rotting as ghosts because we chased a crown none of us needs." "Then say it." Sansa drew her cloak tighter about her shoulders. "Say that the North is its own again, and will be no one's sword but its own conscience. You are a strange king if you think truth is a fault." He almost laughed. "When I have tried truth, Sansa, it has done me more harm than lies ever did. Then let's give harm to those who deserve it and keep to truth anyway." She took a breath that shivered in the cold. "There is another thing. Peter." Sansa's mouth tightened. "He speaks as always. He breathes and schemes at once. He masks it in devotion to me, in promises to the North. He wants me to see threats where there are none and none where they are thick as brambles. We will need him, perhaps, or we will need him quiet. I do not know yet, but I am not sleeping. You'll have Brienne near." "I will," she said, and Brienne, hearing her name, lifted her head from where she stood by a snow-humped boulder. "And Arya?" John smiled without mirth. "If I could find her and hold her still a moment. She's wind in the hills." He reached out and touched the carved cheek with his fingers. He did not believe in old gods or new gods enough to make bargains with them, but he believed in the heart tree because it had been there longer than anything else he knew. "If I say this," he said, "if I say we are neutral, will you stand with me?" "Yes," Sansa said, and did not hesitate. The hall still smelled of ale and tallow, of wet wool and the sulfur bite of torches. The long tables had been scraped and set anew, the last bones cleared and the last spilled wine mopped from the floor. They stood as he entered, the Mormonts, the Glovers, the Umbers and Karstarks reduced to children in their fathers' chairs, the mountain clans with their broad shoulders hunched forward, the Knights of the Vale ironed and severe. Lyanna Mormont's small stiff spine did not bend, though her eyes shone like pebbles in a stream. John felt the hush gather. He did not like emptiness waiting for his words. "You raised me up," he said. "You did it because you lost too many men to keep losing them in wars that aren't ours anymore. The North remembers. We remember our dead. We remember our oaths. We remember that winter isn't a whisper to frighten children. It is standing outside our doors. There was a stir at that. The old ones nodded. He let the quiet fill again. I have fought the dead, he said, and every scar on him seemed to wake. They do not bargain. They do not boast. All they do is take. And they are coming whether you bend the knee or break it. So we will not spend boys of the Bar Rolands and men of the Dreadfort bleeding for a throne in King's Landing. We will not sail to wars in suns we haven't seen in 10 years. The North will be neutral in the quarrel of queens. We will be peacebrokers where we can, and stubborn as rock where we can't. If either queen asks for judgment, they may have it. If they bring war, they will not find welcome here. There were looks, there were murmurs. Lord Glover's mouth twisted. Lord Serwyn narrowed his eyes. Sansa sat beside him on the dais, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed in a way that made it look as if she had been carved by the same hand that shaped the heart tree. Davos stood with one shoulder against a pillar, his gray head cocked in that careful listening tilt he had. Lyanna Mormont spoke first, because of course she did. The Bear Island does not fear queens, she said, straight as a spear. But we do. Fear fools. If you tell me we are not fools to go south, I believe you. Jon Royce said, and if a queen comes north, then she will treat under bread and salt and under guest right, and she will not bring her war inside our hall, Jon said, and his words sent a ripple through the room like wind on tall grass. Peter Baelish smiled his small smile. But if one queen asks for our judgment and the other does not respect it, my lord? Neutrality is a delicate thing to hold when the world has axes. Jon looked at him. Then we remind them the North is a hard place to conquer and not worth the trying, he said, dry as old wood, and glances flickered, grins tucked and quickly hidden. I will send ravens to Dragonstone and to King's Landing. I will ask them to send envoys to White Harbor, where Lord Manderley can feed them until they burst and where the sea lies between us should they forget courtesy. We will speak about truce. We will speak about the dead. We will speak about a winter alliance for the living. He could feel the moment where the room leaned one way and then the other, as if it stood on a ship's deck in a small squall. Sansa stood then, her voice cool. The Lords of the Vale will not march while Lady Arryn is safe in her bed, she said. The North is not alone. She did not glance toward Peter, but Jon saw his fingers rub at each other in that small habit of his when he wanted something and did not yet know how to take it. When do you send these letters? Asked Lord Glover. Now, Jon said, before the ink freezes in the wells. What will you offer? Said a voice, and it took Jon a moment to realize it was his own mouth he had opened to answer. The truth, he said, a thing they haven't much of between them. Kings used to send gold, Davos said, when the hall had erupted into talk and fallen again into a low hum. He had come to the dais without Jon noticing, moving with that old sailor's ease as if the floor might toss beneath him. Or sons. Or swords. Truth is cheaper. Then it should be an easy thing to give, Sansa said, and a thread of humor lit her face before it was gone. The ravens winged out from Winterfell's rookery before the next moon rose. To Dragonstone they went with the wind at their backs, carrying Jon's sealed words asking audience on the matter of the common war. To King's Landing they went with a list of titles trimmed to courtesy and no more. Her Grace Cersei of House Lannister, who sits upon the Iron Throne. Jon had hesitated over that phrasing and then had not altered it. Writing down lies did not make them truer. Neither did writing down truths make them safer. Maester Wolkan dried the sand on the letters with a shaking hand. The cold made him stooped, not age. He was careful to avoid speaking thoughts he could not unsay. Jon sealed his words with plain wax and the direwolf's head. Davos turned each missive in his hand as a man might turn a coin, reading the weight of it. Sansa stood beside the window slit and watched the last raven leap into a sky that had become a bruise of purples and blue. We will need more food, she said. If they come, bread for guest right and salt. And if they stay to bicker, meat. Wyman can feed a fleet, Davos said. I saw White Harbor once when I was young, when the smuggling was honest work and not politics. It's a good port. He'll make a show of welcoming them, and while they eat and drink, we can talk cataracts into rapids. Do you think they will come? Sansa asked, and Jon heard the question beneath the question. Do you think they will leave their pride long enough to carry it north, wrapped in fox fur and old grudges? He thought of the way a woman in black and red might toss her hair like a banner, of the way a queen in scarlet might lift her chin and sneer. He thought of Tyrion Lannister's sharp smile and Jaime's tired eyes, of Varys folded like old silk, of Qyburn's white hands. He thought of ships with black sails and ships with dragon heads, of men who rode like the wind and men who marched like a machine. He thought of the dead, their patience and their hunger. They will, he said, because winter is coming whether they recognize it or not, and because Tyrion is not a fool, and because Jaime Lannister remembers what honor felt like, even if it burned him. And the dragons? Davos asked, half a jest and half serious, and Jon did not answer. He had heard tales in the Watch. Every boy who walked the yard knew names for things he would never see. He seemed now to live in a life where tales walked into the hall and took their share of stew. He slept badly the next nights. He dreamed of snow up to his waist and of cold that gnawed his lungs. He dreamed of a blue, unblinking eye that held him where he stood. He dreamed, once, of a weeping woman in a tower, and woke with his heart hammering and a name on his tongue that was not his. Ghost lifted his head from the floor at the foot of the bed and watched him in the dark. The first answer came on torn, salt-crusted parchment stamped with a three-headed dragon. The writing was neat, unhurried, in a foreign hand that knew Westeros well. Your Grace, it read, in Missandei's hand by the measured strokes. The Queen Daenerys Stormborn hears you and bids you to her hall at Dragonstone. She will hear of these things and judge whether they be truth or fevered northern tales. She will meet your envoys at White Harbor in 1 moon's time, under the protection of Lord Manderly, if you will provide terms that will satisfy her safety. She asks you as well to come yourself, or to send one you trust with the authority to bind the North. She will bring her hand and her quiet counsel. She will not bring war to Lord Manderly's table. Signed beneath with a flourish, Daenerys of the House Targaryen, first of her name, and on with the titles, a list long enough to drape over the side of the table and sweep the floor. It is a very long name to fit in their mouth. Chichis, Davos observed. Men have choked on shorter, Sansa said. And the lions? Jon Royce asked, tapping the table with a gloved finger. The second answer arrived fewer days later than anyone expected. The Lannister courier rode fast and did not slow at the sight of northern weather. The letter was simple and smelled faintly of smoke, as if it had been sealed near flame. Your Grace, it read in Qyburn's careful hand. The Queen has heard and is not unmoved. She will not cross the neck to be fettered by the whims of those who call themselves kings and play neutrality as a game. She will send representatives if certain conditions are met. No dragons within sight of White Harbor, no foreign savages under arms on Manderly's quay, safe passage guaranteed by the Vale's knights both in and out. She wishes to remind you that the North once bled for the crown you now reject, and that traitors are no less traitors for hiding behind snow. Signed, by command of Her Most Gracious Majesty Cersei of the House Lannister. She wants our neck in her hand before she shakes it, Sansa murmured. And she wants to choose the table and who sits at it, Jon said. They will both want that. We'll choose it for them. We'll have the meeting outside Lord Manderly's walls, on the ice if we have to, with the sea on one side and his ships on the other. They will eat bread and salt before they sit. They will not bring quarrel. Can you make a lion do anything she does not choose? Royce asked. No, Jon said. But I can make it her choice to do it. Lord Wyman sent his own letter that took 2 men to carry for the weight of its wax and flourishes. It dripped hospitality like a roast drips fat. Of course, your burn, your grace, my king, he wrote, words tumbling over one another with jolly enthusiasm. White Harbor glows at the thought of such mighty guests. My kitchens are yours, my cellars your swimming pool, my harbor your mirror. I will arrange tables and chairs and dais and awnings and braziers enough to heat the 7 themselves if they should grace us. I will bake bread until I am a baker and salt until I am a salt merchant. All this I will do for you, my liege, and for our dear Lady Sansa, and for the courage of the North, which is to say, the courage of the whole world. For are we not its shield? Come, come. Let us make a fair day out of such cruel weather. When Jon and Sansa rode south for White Harbor, the road was a ribbon between fields of white. Men marched in 2s and 3s along the highway, wrapped to their eyes. Women with baskets trudged from hamlet to hamlet. The small folk watched the standard with a mixture of awe and fear. Ghost kept pace, sometimes ahead like a scout, sometimes so close his fur brushed Jon's boot. The Vale Knights looked like a metal river and did not tire. They found White Harbor like a faint lantern at the edge of a dark sea. The Manderleys had built so much stone into the earth there that it seemed to glow long after the sun died. A soft chalk white that caught torchlight and threw it back at the night. The smell of fish and tar, of salt and old wood and spilled ale, was a comfort after long days of clean, dead cold air. Lord Wyman, with his chins and his smile and his booming laugh, met them at the gate wrapped in a cloak so enormous 2 scullions held it from dragging. "My king!" he cried, as if the city itself spoke through his mouth. "My lady, look at you, pale as good sugar. Come in. Everyone is hungry." The harbor itself seemed to hold its breath. Men were coiling ropes, examining anchors. The masts shivered under a wind that cut. Lord Wyman had erected a pavilion along the quay using the hides of beasts so large Jon did not recognize their names. There was a table long as a barge, with space marked, carefully, judiciously, at either end where envoys might sit without glaring too hard across their bread. Sansa's eyes measured everything and found it wanting and then acceptable. Davos made small adjustments that no one noticed made them safer. "We've had visitors," Lord Wyman confided as a boy brought mulled wine to warm their hands. "A thin man with a beard that thinks itself wise and a woman small and sharp as a knife. Your sister is safer for it." "Which sister?" Jon asked, but his stomach had already clenched at the thought of Peter's voice like a too-polished coin clinking against stone. "Mine," Sansa said. "He means the one who lives in my shadow like a spider. Leave him to me." On the 4th day the dragons came. They were shadows at first, dark smudges against a pale sky. Then they were great arcs that threw wind into the harbor and made ships creak as if they were animals unsettled by thunder. They swept over the city low enough that Jon saw the light shine through the thin membranes of their wings, saw the way their muscles rippled when they banked. White Harbor bit back a scream and then roared, a sound that filled the air with the heat of fear and wonder. Children laughed and men swore and women crossed themselves twice on instinct. The biggest landed on a spit of rock beyond the quay where no soldier could reach without a boat and a little courage. The other 2 circled again, and then one glided to settle on the beach with its head turned away from the pavilion, as if the talks were beneath it. The 3rd remained above, riding the cold. Daenerys Targaryen came not as a conqueror with a whip of flames, but as a woman wrapped in furs too heavy for her, cheeks bright with the wind. Tyrion Lannister walked at her shoulder with Davos's knowing little smile mirrored on his mouth. Behind them came Grey Worm with a spear that looked more like an extension of his back than a weapon, Missandei with a leather satchel, and a handful of men and women who looked as if the sea had washed their country from their hair but not from their faces. Ser Jorah Mormont came too, wearing shame and age like armor. His eyes found Lyanna Mormont in the crowd and flinched almost imperceptibly when she stared at him as if he were something washed up by the tide. "Bread and salt," Lord Wyman sang, and his voice boomed, and Daenerys took the bread and the salt and touched them to her lips with gravity. "Your Grace," Jon said, and inclined his head as to an equal. His title weighed in his mouth like something newly minted and too bright. "Your Grace," she returned. "It's very cold." If she had expected courtesies, she did not show the disappointment. Her eyes went quickly from him to the men around him, to Sansa, to Brienne, to the Vale Knights with their aplomb. She looked like a person who had learned to count her advantages before she counted her friends. "Welcome to White Harbor," Sansa said, the words falling in that musical cadence that made lords forget what they were. "We have brought the weather for you." Missandei's smile flared, surprised and delighted, and was gone. On the 6th day the lions came by land. They had refused the sea crossing and the dragons as well. They had refused every term that made them look any less than in command. And yet here they were, walking in under the watch of the Vale and of the North. Jaime rode at their head with a plain cloak and a face that looked as if courtesy sanded it down. Bronn rode beside him wearing insolence like a shield. Qyburn was there and a handful of men in crimson who made the cold seem an insult. They dismounted and took bread and salt with a reluctance as deliberate as spitting. Jaime's gaze lifted and took the measure of the dragons and then fell again to find Brienne across the quay. The look between them was a map of a country both of them had crossed and lost and still carried. "Lord Manderley," Jaime said and nodded. "Your city is very fair." "It is fat, actually," Wyman said, unashamed, "and hospitable. Come, eat food that is not boiled in spite." There was a dance, then, of seats and names and nods. Jon sat in the center with Sansa one step behind him, slightly to the right. To his left Tyrion, to his right Davos. Daenerys sat where the wind could not strike her directly, and her dragons lay like lions on the sand, pretending they did not listen. Grey Worm stood without shifting weight, and Missandei wrote. Jaime sat with Bronn's chair slightly behind his, which would read as deference to anyone who didn't know them and read as lack of trust to anyone who did. Qyburn sat everywhere and nowhere, a presence like a cold thought. "Bread has been shared," Lord Wyman announced. "Salt has been shared. The sea is there to drown the discourteous and the land is there to bury them. Speak." Jon waited for someone else to begin and then understood it was his voice they were all poised to hear and his words they would count like coins. He felt Ghost press against his leg under the table as if to remind him he could be more than his fear. He let his gaze move to each of them and stop and move again until Tyrion raised his brows and Missandei shifted her quill in a way that meant, "Now, I will speak plain," Jon said. "The cold you felt coming into this harbor is a kindness. There is a colder that kills. I have fought it. I have watched men die of it and rise again with blue eyes and dead hands. The walkers are real. The dead are real. They will be a plague that does not care for titles." He looked to Jaime. "They do not bow to a throne." He looked to Daenerys. "Or to fire. They devour fear and flesh alike. I want you to stop winging knives at each other in your minds long enough to put them in the same enemy's chest." "Convenient," Qyburn said, mild. "Every rebel says their war is a war for all, and every traitor says their treason is a kind of higher loyalty. Forgive me if the Queen asks more than a tale." "She wants proof," Tyrion said, not unkindly. "She has been lied to by people she loved and by people who loved lying to her. It is a habit one has to break by evidence. Bring her a damn hand that doesn't stop moving after it's cut," Bronn offered, and laughed when no one else did. "I've seen stranger things, usually at night when someone else paid." "We do not need to play at parlor tricks," Sansa said. Her hands were folded so tight the knuckles were white. "There are men at the wall who will vouch with their reputations and their scars. The Lord Commander of what's left of the Watch is no friend to my brother's crown or to this war. He will tell you what he saw. And there is something more." Her gaze flicked, ever so briefly, to the quiet boy in the thick cloak in the second rank of the northern delegation. Bran's face was a mask of winter, remote and unfathomable. But when Sansa named him, as if by magic, he seemed to return to the present. "My brother has sight that is not seen. What he knows is not hearsay." This raised eyebrows from all sides, and Tyrion leaned forward, curiosity alight. "You are the boy who fell," he said almost gently, "and who lived." "I am," Bran said. His voice had become thin, but it carried. "The dead are on their way. The wall fractures like an old tooth. The Night King remembers the taste of dragon flame from a time long before you were born, and he does not fear it as much as you hope." Daenerys's mouth tightened at that. It was not in her to bend her head before anyone else's version of the world. "I have 3 dragons," she said. "They are not songs. They are sons," Missandei murmured, writing without looking up. "Whatever they are," Davos said. "They are only 3. There are more dead than the world has food for, and more coming." He raised his hands a little, as if to show their emptiness. "We are not here to call anyone a liar. We are here to call a halt." Jaime had been watching Jon with the blank look of a man who has learned to keep himself behind his eyes. He glanced at Tyrion and then back. "You want a truce?" "Yes." "You want us to stop long enough to freeze," Bronn said. "Long enough to live," Jon said sharply, and He word cracked in the cold like a whip. "Stop your war until winter passes. Cease hostilities. No marches across the neck. No sieges. No assassins," he added, "for everyone's benefit and for Cersei's most of all. Aid to the wall. Men at Eastwatch, spears at Castle Black, patrols along the Fist. And there is dragonglass beneath Dragonstone." His eyes cut to Daenerys. "I want it dug with your leave and turned into knives and arrowheads until every northern peasant eats off a plate of it if he has to. Give it to us and to your men and to theirs." He nodded at Jaime. "Let the living borrow it from the earth's larder while it's still ours to borrow." "You ask much," Daenerys said. "I ask whatever it costs fewer lives," Jon said. "A truce requires trust," Jaime said, because he had long ago learned how to sound like someone who wasn't mocking a person's earnestness. "What do you offer that would make us believe you will keep it? What will you do when you humiliate us with your neutrality? Does your peace not tilt the board toward the one who keeps it best?" Jon did not look away. "I will keep it. I will not faint with truth like some men. If one breaks it, I will tell the other who did. If both break it, I'll say it aloud where gods and men can hear. You're both more afraid of being caught cheating than you are of losing a piece or two. I can use that." Tyrion's laugh was small and involuntary. "He knows us," he said, not without admiration. "Who keeps watch on you?" Jaime asked. "My sister," Jon said. "And mine." He nodded to Sansa and to Arya, who had appeared like a shadow near the back and had her eyes fixed on Peter Baelish with a look that would have cut him if looks were blades. "My hand," he added, and Davos raised his eyebrows at suddenly being so named. Sansa said, "We will keep hostages." The word rolled across the table like a stone. Daenerys stiffened. Grey Worm's eyes narrowed. Jaime did not move, but something in him became stiller, as if he had turned from flesh to marble. "Guest hostages," Sansa corrected, calm. "In the old way. Not fetters, not dungeons. Proof. Those who sit at our table and go hunting with our men and learn our kitchens and our yards and return when the season turns having eaten our bread. The North will keep 2 and send 2 in turn, if you wish it." "Who?" Daenerys asked, cautious. "Not your hand," Sansa said, quick as a slip of a knife. "Tyrion is not my prisoner, and I will not have him be one in truth after so many have called him that with less cause. Ser Jorah," she paused, "is northern born and knows our snows. If his queen will lend him, he will be safe with us. And we will keep another of her counsel if she will send one she can afford to not have at her side. For the Lannisters." She let it hang. "Take me," Jaime said, and Bronn banged the heel of his hand on the table, half rising. "You are mad," he said. "You couldn't be safe in a rabbit hutch." "It's fitting," Jaime said, ignoring him. He did not look at Brienne. He did not look at anyone. "Send me. The Queen trusts me, as far as she trusts anyone. And if I die in the North, so much the worse for me. If I return, then you have your proof." "That is brave," Tyrion said softly. "That is necessary," Jaime said. Daenerys looked to Jorah and found him already nodding. Something passed between them that had more to do with loyalty than with wisdom. "He will go," she said, "and I will send Missandei as well. She will read your oaths with the care they require and tell me when you mean what you say and when you merely say it." "And you will take who from us?" Jon asked the lions. Qyburn's mouth unfolded. "The Stark girl," he said, with a look that said he had set a trap he would enjoy seeing sprung. "The Lady Sansa. It is her tongue that is honeying this bitter draught. If we must swallow it, let us keep a spoon in our pocket." Arya moved, a ripple in the air like a hawk diving. Brienne's hand went to her sword and stopped halfway when Sansa merely lifted a finger. "No," Sansa said, in a voice that would have made kings step backward. She smiled, and the smile was winter. "You may have me when you hold the north in your hand and squeeze until the juice runs down your wrist." "Take me?" Jon said, angry black blooming behind his eyes. "Not her. If you want." "Nothing," Jaime cut in, and the word was a lash. "We will take nothing we are not offered freely, or we take the war we claim we're putting down. We are not fools, Qyburn." For the first time his voice had heat, and he shot the thin white man a look that carried a history Jon did not know. "We will take the word of the North, and we will send our word with me. That is enough." It was not enough for Cersei, Jon knew. Nothing he could give would scaffold her trust. But Jaime was not his sister, and Tyrion was not his father, and there were other ways to lay a bridge than stones. "Good," Jon said. "Then we have something like a beginning." The pact took shape like a lattice, slowly, carefully, each piece balanced by another. Men who had never thought to be on the same side of anything signed their names on the same parchment and watched the ink sink with equal suspicion. Missandei's handwriting made it beautiful. Davos's made it plain. They argued about scorpions and ships, about whether the Dothraki could ride on northern fields without turning farmers' crop to mud. They fought over the position of braziers in the camps because it was easier than admitting they were frightened. Wyman charmed both sets of envoys with a roast boar so tender even Grey Worm's reserve cracked long enough for him to ask for more. At night, in a room looking toward the sea, Sansa and Jon sat around a hearth with Arya mostly in the firelight and Bran mostly out of it. The quiet between them had once been a ravine and was now a rope bridge. Swayed, but it held. Davos came in and out. Brienne stood a long vigil at the door because she did not see the quiet. "He'll come," Arya said, staring into the flame. "Baelish, he'll come at you sideways. He can't help himself." "He already has," Sansa said, tired. "He has whispered to Lord Glover that the Vale should not waste its steel on false peace. He has told the Mormonts that the dragons will roast our children to lichens. He has told me that you are not who you say you are, and that I should be careful who I let past my gate. He has asked me what it would mean if the lions took you, brother, if the North had to be a widow again before it had even wed." "What did you say?" Jon asked. Sansa looked at him as if he were very foolish. "I told him to stand by the fire if he was cold and to take a walk outside when he warmed." "Let me cut his throat," Arya said, mild and deadly. She had become a creature who could say such things as if they were a matter of whether to boil an egg. "Not yet," Bran said. His eyes were half closed, and in their gray there was something he had carried back from places no one else could go. "He will step into the light soon and shout himself proud, and then we will see what we need to see." On the 12th day the pact was set. They signed beneath the awning with the sea crashing and the dragons lifting their heads at the sound as if some memory had been stirred. Tyrion's name sat under Daenerys's like a shadow. Jaime's under the Lannister lion like a rebuke. Jon's was plain, the ink blotted where he had pressed too hard. Sansa did not sign. She did not need to. She stood, and it was as if she had written every word with the way she held her chin. They made the old oath at the heart tree planted years ago in the Merman's court, and the city breathed out, and the harbor took the sound and made it its own. Jaime left that afternoon for Winterfell with a dozen men who did not speak unless spoken to. Yora, by some instinct that was either wisdom or discomfort, fell in with them without fuss. Missandei kissed Daenerys on both cheeks and said something in that other language that made the queen's throat work. She went up to Sansa then and to Jon. "I will make a list of your words," she said, "so that when we are old we can see if we kept them." "You assume we will be old," Jon said, and his mouth tilted. "I like that." The work began without drama because the work did not care for it. Ships unloaded the first crates of dragonglass at White Harbor, and more sailed out to fetch it raw from Dragonstone, where the miners had begun to tear the earth like bakers kneading a mountain into dough. Gendry arrived with the Brotherhood, sun-browned and wary, and fell in love with the forge like a man with an old, difficult friend. The smithy grew so hot even in winter that men lingered there for the promise of warmth, and the sound of hammers made a heartbeat for the city. Northern boys learned how to fix dragonglass heads to arrows. Old men learned how to hold spears halves again, and women learned how to laugh with their mouths closed when the Dothraki tried to ride on ice. At Eastwatch, Dolorous Ed got his first letter from a queen that did not begin with a threat and wrote back something so dry it crackled. Men streamed north, Celtigar spearmen with teeth chattering. Second sons from fair cities who had never seen a sky without smoke. Hedge knights who thought death better than dying old. A trickle of Tyrell men with no high garden to go home to. The brotherhood without banners with Thuras drinking less and staring more. The free folk watched them all with the suspicious curiosity of men looking at a different kind of herd animal. Bran went to the Godswood when the days were at their shortest, and he did not come straight back. He sat under the heart tree at Winterfell in one of those nights where sound carries like breath in glass. The ravens came and he saw through them, and he saw the wall as a man might lay a hand on the back of an old beast. With pity and with recognition. He saw the places where the spell that bound it thinned like rope chafed over long edges. He saw the sea, and how in the cold the sea could become land, and how the dead marched as if the water were their meadow. He did not move when Sansa came and put a blanket around his shoulders and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Jaime Lannister stepped into Winterfell's hall like a man walking into the mouth of a memory. The last time he had been a guest there, he had been handsome enough for his arrogance to be called charm and foolish enough to believe that was worth something. Now he was tired, his hair cut close and already gray at the edges, his stump carefully covered. Brienne came down the steps with a look in her eyes that she had not intended anyone to see, and his face changed without changing. Sansa greeted him with courtesy so perfect it was almost a reprimand. Arya watched him as if he were a lesson. "I never thought to be your guest," Jaime said when the formalities were done. "But I brought your words with me," and he touched his chest where the folded parchment lay. "I brought them to hold me to mine." "You will be safe here," Sansa said. "If you keep your word, you will be safer than anywhere else in the north. And if I break it, you will be the only person surprised." He laughed despite himself, a quick bark, and glanced at Jon. "Your sister is very kind. She has learned to be when it costs less," Jon said. Arya slipped out then and found Peter Baelish at the end of a shadow where his favorite pastime was pretending not to listen. She stepped so lightly he did not hear her until she spoke, and by then the words had already landed. "You look at the world," she said, "and see ladders. Here there are no ladders, only trees. They will not bear your weight if you climb them like you do people." "My lady," he said with knightly polish. "Such words." "Soon," Arya said, and that was all. From the south came one last letter, quiet and venomous and wrapped around a promise. Cersei wrote to Jaime in a hand he knew better than his own. She told him he had betrayed her by leaving, and then she told him to do what he'd promised and keep the truce, and then she told him to be ready to abandon it at a word. She told him of gold she intended to spend, of men she intended to buy, of a company that would march through the desert and across the sea when the ice began to crack. She closed with, "Come back to me when you have ensured our place," and Jaime read it with a face like stone and let Brienne read it too. She handed it back without a change in her expression. "It would be easier to be a villain," he said. "It would be easier to be a sheep," she said. "Except when the wolves come." He sat with her in the yard and watched northern boys build walls out of snow to learn the way men use their hands when they are afraid. In the forge Gendry hammered a length of pale glass sheen into something that took a dragon's breath and turned it into a blade. He brought it to Jaime like an offering, a sword hilted well enough that a one-handed man could hold it. "I made it for a knight once," he said, "without knowing his name. I like knowing it now." Jaime took it awkwardly, tested the weight with the hand he had. Brienne's mouth quirked almost into a smile when it did not clatter to the stones. "Name it," she said. "I already have too many names," he said. When the dead came, it was not like thunder. There was no boom loud enough to break a man's certainty. There was only the quietness of snow, the way it muffles the world, the way it carries only certain sounds. The first sign at Eastwatch was the sea lifting and freezing and lifting again, like a creature drawing a long breath. Ed's men watched and did not understand, and then they understood too much. The night itself seemed to grow bones. The horn sounded. It sounded again. It sounded until men were falling over their own feet to answer it, until the dragons, miles away at their eyrie, raised their heads and roared. John was on the road between White Harbor and Winterfell when the raven found him, and he turned the horses in a move so sharp men cursed and then followed. He pushed hard and cursed every stone and hill between him and the wall. Daenerys had come north with her dragons under the terms of the truce she had made, and now she saw where the truth will always stand when titles fall. In the line of men between the living and the dead. She did not wait for his arrival to act. She did not like waiting. The dragons took the sky, and the sound of their wings was a drumbeat. The dead walked on water and sand alike, and the crack of the wall was not fire but ice. It did not shatter. It peeled, like bark from an old tree. Ed gave his orders in a voice that would have made Sam smile, and men who had never held a spear before held one then, because not holding one would be to go to a place they were not ready to go. The first dragon flamed a path through the ranks of blue-eyed soldiers, and they fell and rose and fell again when the flame seared deep enough to reach what animated them. The second dragon wheeled, looking for the one who commanded. The third remained above, its neck extended long and proud, its rider searching the white for a shape older than men know. Jon reached Eastwatch when most men's breath had already become knives in their chests. He threw himself into a fight that had not been made for swords, and yet he found he had a talent for living in places not made for anything but dying. He moved like the snow and like the thin dark line on a map that is a river when men are thirsty. Ghost tore and returned and tore again, white fur streaked with the black and blue of the enemy. Davos shouted orders from a parapet with a voice that overrode the wind. He saw the Night King then as clearly as he had seen anyone in his life. The way he stood still in a sea of motion, the way the air around him seemed harder than the air a man breathed. He saw Daenerys' face set toward that figure with a fierceness that made her younger and older at once. The dragon she rode opened its mouth, and fire was the answer men had always found when the world asked questions too terrible to endure. The Night King raised his hand. Later, when men told the story, they argued whether the spear of ice that hurtled up from the Night King's arm moved as fast as an arrow or as slow as a falling thought. They argued whether the sound it made was like a scream or like a stone dropped in a deep well. What they did not argue about was what happened next. The spear struck the dragon Daenerys had not been riding. It struck true and deep and furious. A sound came out of the creature that made birds 1,000 miles away lift off their branches. It fell like a burning comet, and the steam that rose when it hit water was a new weather. The ranks of the dead seemed to lean forward as if they, too, admired a thing that killed so beautifully. "Go!" Jon shouted, and did not know if he meant it for Daenerys or for himself. He had no idea if hope was a thing you could order to move. It was not that they won the fight at Eastwatch. Winning was a word for tourneys and for songs. They held long enough to drag the living to the north side of the wall, and then along the ice road back toward Castle Black. Long enough to pull men with blue lips over thresholds where the magic still held for a little while. They retreated with dignity only because the dead did not care about dignity. The dragon that had fallen did not fall to rest. The Night King went to it with a patience that made movements delicate, and before the bodies of men had even cooled, the river that had been sea was disturbed by a thing that had been a dragon and was now not anything that belonged in a world with breath. Its eyes opened, blue, void, something else. And a sound came from it that was not the cry of a living creature. The men who heard it would never again sleep without hearing. The wall did not fall all at once. It began to die at the edges like an old man dissolving into the many small thieves of time. It held where the magic was thickest and gave where the sea had licked it thin. Ed set a guard and a second guard and a third. Daenerys took the air again with the remaining dragons. The living walked backward before the tide and treated their footprints as if they were fragile. When they reached Winterfell, the city had already become the place where every story in the world wanted to end. The Vale had sent more men than anyone thought they had. The North had scraped its villages clean. The Riverlands had sent what they could without phrase to trip them. A handful of Dornish fighters arrived in boots that sank and cursed beautifully and learned quickly that the cold makes poets of everyone. Sansa had made rooms appear where there were none. The kitchens boiled without stopping. Lord Wyman swept in with a fleet of bakers who could feed a besieged city on flour and rage. Cersei's answer to the news of the wall came in two forms. The first was a letter telling the North to die valiantly, and the second was a messenger who did not reach Winterfell because Arya put a knife through his heart when he stepped off the road to piss, and no one ever knew her name in King's Landing. Jaime read the letter and folded it and put it in the fire. He watched it curl like a leaf. Brienne stood beside him and did not say anything because there was nothing he had not already told himself. "We will need to trust," Jon told the men and women who needed to hear it, and those who couldn't bear to, and he watched the word travel through them like a rumor that no one liked but everyone believed. He stood in the yard and showed boys whose hands shook how to hold a spear so that it would not slip. He went to the smithy and smudged his face with the same soot on Gendry's. He sat with Sansa late into nights that pretended to be days and learned the names of the wives who had let their husbands go and the names of the old men who had taken young boys' place. Daenerys walked the walls with him once. She was silent for a long while. The dragon above made a sound like breath when it was very cold and you could see it. "I have not wanted much that was given," she said at last. "When I wanted and took, I told myself I was owed, that I remembered what had been stolen from me and repaid with interest. This is different." "Yes," Jon said. "I hate different," she said. And then, because she had not entirely become the thing that had tried to swallow her, she smiled. "But I don't hate you." He looked out at the white. "It would be better if you did. Probably." She leaned her forearms on the parapet the way a man might in a dockyard. "Your sister hates me." "She does not," Jon said. "She saves hate for tools that work better than many men." "And for your enemies," Daenerys said. "And for mine." The night the dead reached Winterfell, the snow stopped falling as if the world wanted a better view. The field outside the walls had been seeded with iron and glass, trenches cut and soaked in pitch, traps set that would have made the old kings proud. Jon stood in the yard in armor that felt like history's hand on his shoulders and watched the first line approach. It was neat, which seemed wrong. He had always thought it would be chaos. And then the chaos came, a smothering sort that felt like waking up with someone's hand over your mouth. They had planned for flame and for screams and for confusion. They had planned to keep their line steady and not chase their fear when it ran. They had planned to use the dragons as torches and as scythes. They had not planned for how quiet the dead were. They had not planned for the way that could become its own sound. Men who had faced siege broke not when the gates buckled, but when their thoughts did. Jon moved among them, and Davos did, and Jaime did, and Sansa watched from the wall with a bow in her hand she had learned to string since last spring, and Arya did not move like anything that could be taught, and Brienne held the center like a story mothers tell their children, so they will think there are people like that in the world. The dragons came low and flamed so that the pitch caught and the trenches lit and the night had a new sun. The dead tried to pour through and burned and were pushed from behind by more of their kind. The smell was like hair and wintergreen and oil. Somewhere, too far away, a horn that was not a horn sounded, and Bran looked up from where he sat in the Godswood, from where Theon and his iron men stood around him with faces like carved rock, and his eyes were black as the gap between stars. In the end, and it is always in the end because endings are the only times men agree on what happened, Bran saw where the Night King would be. He did not call it fate. He did not call it anything. He told Arya in a voice that had learned to be quiet even inside his own skull. She moved the way a quick thought does. The Night King came to the Heart Tree because the Heart Tree is a mouth and an eye and a memory, and he did not want any of those to survive. He came through men who had died for other men and now died again. Theon died the way he would have chosen if you had given him his choice. The Night King reached out and the world held its breath. Where there might have been a boy, once there was a thing that had become his name, and where there might have been a wolf, once there was Ghost with his teeth at the ankle of something colder than ice, and where there might have been a girl, once there was Arya. She moved like the space between heartbeats. The blade went where it had to go. The sound the Night King made was not a sound. It was a gap where noise should be. Men died anyway. They died then, and they died later, and they died for weeks afterward of things that seemed as small as the loss of a toe and as large as the loss of a son. Diener. Wyatt stood over Yora on a field that had been a yard and would be a field again, and she cried like a woman who had forgotten how, and Missandei counted the names like beads. Jaime knelt beside Brienne because she would not sit and asked her what she would call him now, and she hit him very hard on the shoulder and told him to save his breath for living. Davos found Ed among the dead and said nothing because there are times when speaking makes lesser the thing you mean. Sansa sat in a room where the only sound was breathing and then not breathing and wrote with a quill down to its spine and then another and another. In the dawn that was too pale to be anything but dawn, Jon stood in the God's Wood looking at the place where the heart tree bled. He did not feel triumph. He felt only empty like a cup. Ghost stood with a torn ear and a low, grateful sound that was almost a purr and almost a sob. Bran opened his eyes, and for a moment there was a boy there who had once been carried on shoulders and laughed. He cried then, soundless, and Sansa came and held his face in her hands as if she could keep it from becoming what it would be again. The truce had held. The living had stood together because death was large enough to make them small. Now the problem was the size of men. Cersei did not come north. She did not send men. She marched south to spend gold that had waited for this very purpose and hired the Golden Company like a woman furnishing a house she intended never to leave. She did not plan on any of this. She did not plan on Jaime sending a raven from Winterfell that said, "It is done. Stand down." She did not plan on her brother's quiet last rebellion. The letter came to Winterfell as well. Sansa read it first because the ravens went to her hands now without needing instruction. She read it and considered the lamplight and the ink and the turn of the letters that had once been so neat and had become a little less so. "You keep hostages," it said, "but I find I have always been one. If I return now, I will break the pact we kept, because she will break it with me. I have left the Queen. It is a treason more quiet than most. Feels larger. Tell Bronn he can come sit by your fire. Tell Brienne what she already knows and forgive her if she does not say it first. Tell your king that the only word that matters now is after, and that he is a fool if he does not believe you have thought more clearly about it than he has." "You could go after him," Arya said, because she still believed knives could fix things. "End her. A piece cut clean lasts. Piece cut clean turns to rot if you do it in a dark cellar and hide the body," Sansa said. "And children trip on the grave when they play. There will be a day for Cersei Lannister. It may not be ours. After is now." She folded the letter and tucked it into a small pocket she had sewn into her dresses when she was learning what to keep close. "Call the lords," she told a boy, and he ran. Jon faced the after like a man who had carried a mantle and was ready to shrug it off without dropping it. The Great Council was not a thing the North had ever loved. They liked their decisions closer to the fire and farther from pomp. But they liked disaster less. Lords came from roads that had only just opened, on horses that had only just eaten. The Vale sent their men of quiet iron. The Stormlands sent a handful of boys with faces that had never seen anything but rain and now had seen snow and thought it was a trick. Dorne sent a woman with a mouth so sharp it could have cut glass and the sense to keep it closed until the right moment. The Reach sent gardeners where their gardeners had not been burned. Daenerys came without dragons because she had none to spare. She came without Missandei because Missandei would not leave Winterfell now and stood with a fur-trimmed cloak that did not know how to fit her and spoke the names of the dead as if she were still weaving them into a story. Tyrion came and looked at the hall and smiled because he recognized that he had wanted to be alive to see it. Jaime sat at the back with his hands folded, the impression of a man who had learned finally that watching is a stronger art than speaking. Jon stood and said, "I resign the crown." It went through the room like a knife through honey, smoothly and then in a rush. He had a way of breaking things without meaning to. "I took it because you asked me," he said, and he did not raise his voice because he did not need to. "I am giving it back to you because you deserve to decide how to live when you are not dying. I told you we would be neutral and that we would keep to truth. That does not mean we will hide here while the South burns again because men prefer old habits to new hope. I will broker a peace if you let me. I will take bread and salt across every table from here to the Red Keep if I have to. But I will not keep a crown that I do not need, and that you do not need me to wear." He glanced at Sansa. "The North should be itself." "We would like that," Lady Lyanna Mormont said, as if he had asked her whether she preferred tea or wine. The argument that followed was not fierce. It was simply long. Men who had lost their sons argued for independence and then for the security of an agreement instead. Women who had lost their husbands argued for trade because flour would run out faster than pride. The southern lords wanted a queen who would not burn them. The northern lords wanted a queen who would leave them alone. They agreed on little until they began to eat cold meat with their fingers and drink warmed wine like medicine, and then they agreed on more. In the end, they wrote it down because words are easier to keep than moods. The North would be a kingdom unto itself. It would be allied by blood and by bread and by boundary with the rest of the realm. The rest of the realm would choose its ruler by a council in which all great houses would have voice, and in which lesser houses would have representation by rotation. The Iron Throne would be melted down and made into plowshares or into nothing. There were arguments about the poetry of it that lasted long into the night and were settled by Sansa saying a chair that had killed as many men as that one had should simply be gone. Daenerys would be the first among equals for a term agreed upon, to be renewed or not by future councils. She agreed to this not because she loved it but because she saw what would happen if she did not. She saw the way Jon's eyes softened when he talked of fields and harvests, and that too played a part she would not admit. "What of your birth?" Tyrion asked Jon later, when the room was a map of tired bodies. "You are the proof that this could be more complicated than any of us would like." "Birth doesn't change what I am," Jon said. He had not told anyone but the ones who already knew. He had no desire to make men choose between stories. "I'm still a man who has the wrong name and the right reasons." "The realm is lucky," Tyrion said, but he said it with a sadness that made it seem as if luck was a thing you could taste but not keep. Cersei's end came on a rainless night in the Red Keep where the shadow of a dragon had fallen once and made the city hold its breath. She sat with a goblet and a man who had always been an answer to any question a cruel person asked, and she planned. Jaime came quietly, because he had learned that noise is a sickness. She looked up and said his name the way a woman says a word before she closes a book. "You smell of snow," she said. "Have you come to choke me with it?" "I have come to tell you that no one is coming to choke you," he said. "There is no army at your gates. There isn't a single dragon in the sky. You've won everything you could have won and lost everything you will notice only when you die." Her eyes were tired deep in. She had not expected to grow old like this, even as little as she had grown old. "And you have come to kill you," he said, "while I still have the strength, before you make me do it in front of people." He relaxed his face as if he were letting a mask hang on a hook. "I will not do it nicely. You do not deserve a story where I do a noble thing and men clap." She laughed then, a brittle little thing, and raised her glass. "To love," she said, and the word shook as if it had not been used for a long while. He was not kind and he was not cruel. He was quick. It is possible to love someone and kill them. Men have done stranger. The city did not burn. The Golden Company stood in their tents waiting for orders that did not come. Qyburn ran with a list of contingencies and fell over his own foot, a thing he would not have done if he had planned for it, and cracked his skull like an egg on a stair. The bells did not ring. The dawn came gray. At Winterfell they did not cheer when the raven came with the news. They did not know how to cheer for that. Jaime sat in the yard with his head bowed and Brienne stood beside him. Their breath made little clouds that drifted toward one another and combined and rose. 1. They built a chair in King's Landing, not a throne. It was made of wood, and Sansa said with satisfaction that it could be chopped up for firewood if it began to think too much of itself. Daenerys sat in it like a woman who had forgotten how to sit and who learned again. She sent men back to their homes and she sent women to their sons' graves, and she did not hang those who spoke against her until she had let herself be persuaded out of it 3 times. Tyrion found that he still had words. Missandei found that she still had numbers. Grey Worm led men whose names he did not forget anymore. Jon went north with Ghost, and he went so easily it surprised him. He had not realized how much he had been holding his breath. The wall would be rebuilt in a way that made it less a myth and more a bastion. The free folk would pass back and forth like the tide, because they knew now that borders are only as true as the people who keep them. Dolorous Ed would never laugh again, but men who had known him would smile like they might have, and that was something. Sam came with Gilly and the children and a cart of books that would have impressed any city and explained it with the ease of someone who had finally become himself. Sansa ruled the North the way you mend a blanket. Small stitches, patient, and with thread stronger than the whole. She saw the Bears and the Glovers and the Serwins and the Karstarks, and sometimes she saw, when she slept and woke with her heart in her mouth, a room lined in green where she had learned to be someone else. She was not that person any longer. When Peter Baelish finally made his play, in a hall loud with food and soft with contentment, she let him speak himself into his own noose. Arya stood at her shoulder and Bran said what he had seen. The old lords did not like it, and then they liked it very much. Baelish wept at the end, but only for himself. They did not make a feast of it. Arya did not stay. She said, "There are edges where the maps lie," and left with a ship that had only half a name. She would write on scraps of strange parchment to a brother who had never really been a brother and a sister who had become a steel thread through the fabric of a country. Sometimes they would understand what she meant, and sometimes they would simply be glad she was still alive. Tyrion wrote a book and burned it and wrote it again. Missandei built schools and then she built more. Bronn bought an inn and was offended by the quality of the wine and improved it and got rich and complained that he had not intended to get rich respectably. Brienne became a story and learned she would rather keep swords sharp than listen to that story told badly. Gendry forged and his shoulders rounded and he was content, which was an act of rebellion he enjoyed more than any fight. Daenerys came north once, year after the last snow that truly mattered fell. She came without dragons because there were none now to bring. She came without an army because she needed to see the north without helmets in the way. She stood in the Godswood with Sansa and watched the way light moves through leaves, even red leaves that are always summer and always winter at once. "I have learned to dislike thrones more than once now," she said. "Good," Sansa said. "You are almost respectable. I will try to improve." "You will fail when it matters," Sansa said, "and succeed when it does not. That is the way of most rulers. Try to do the opposite." Jon did not meet her there. He was beyond the wall with Ghost, teaching a boy how to walk in snow without making a sound, bending his head to speak to a woman who had decided to be a chieftain and found she might be good at it, and waking up to the mornings when the air is so clear it feels like a kind of drink. He would come back for councils and for long nights of drinking old stories and for the births of children and for the deaths of men. He would come back when Sansa wrote and said, "The spring is here and we do not know what to do with it." On one such morning, alone between trees that had seen older kings and older knights, Jon ran his hand along the bark of a young, red-leaved sapling someone had planted a year ago where there had been a gap. The tree did not know crowns or packs or wars. It knew only light and cold and the slow lift and settling of the world. Ghost put his head under Jon's hand and wafted a breath that smelled of meat and old blood and pine. Somewhere far to the south a woman sat in a chair of wood and wrote a law that no one would break for 10 years and then everyone would, and she would write another. Somewhere to the west, on a deck slick with salt, a girl looked at the sun and smiled to herself because today she would go farther than yesterday. He thought of all the names he had worn like cloaks: bastard, brother, lord commander, rebel, king. He had decided, without telling anyone, that the best of them had been beggar and friend. He had decided that it was a good thing he had never learned to be what other people wanted him to be. He had survived it. The wind moved through the branches like speech. It did not say anything he needed to hear. He already knew it. He stood for a time and then he walked, and the snow under his boots was a familiar crisp, and the day ahead of him was a thing large enough to step into.